Behind closed doors, where the whisper of truth mingled with secret rituals, Freemasonry remained a closed men's club for centuries. But what if I told you that the path into this mysterious brotherhood for women was not just closed, but effectively forbidden? Today we will uncover one of the most acute topics in the history of Freemasonry: the struggle for equality that unfolded within its ancient walls. How did it happen that a community proclaiming brotherhood and equality so long excluded half of humanity? We will delve into history to understand why women were denied access to Masonic lodges, how this prohibition shaped their destiny, and what changes are occurring now as the world demands justice even from the most closed organizations. This is not just a story about the fight for rights. It is a narrative about the transformation of traditions and the reinterpretation of ancient symbols. We have come a long way, exploring how traditions and symbols shaped Freemasonry, making it a predominantly male space. But the world does not stand still. Global social changes raging in society inevitably reach even the most closed institutions. And one of the most powerful currents that changed the face of the 20th and 21st centuries was the feminist movement. Its influence on Freemasonry is a story of struggle, adaptation, and the reinterpretation of age-old foundations. Feminism, in its essence, has always strived for gender equality, for the recognition of women as full and equal members of society. And this aspiration directly clashed with Masonic tradition, which, as we recall, excluded women from its ranks. In the 19th century, when the first wave of feminism fought for suffrage and access to education, Freemasonry remained an unshakable bastion of male brotherhood. Women suffragists, demanding a seat at the table of political decisions, hardly thought about Masonic lodges, but their struggle laid the foundation for future changes. The more women gained positions in public life, the less logical and justified their complete prohibition in organizations proclaiming the principles of freedom and equality seemed. The turning point was the beginning of the 20th century, when feminist ideas began to penetrate into various spheres of life. The creation of the mixed order Le droit humain, which we have already discussed, became a direct reflection of these sentiments. Its founders, Maria d'Erasme and Georges Martin, were not just Masons. They were convinced feminists who believed in the possibility of Freemasonry open to all. They argued that the principles of brotherhood and sisterhood are inseparable, and that true Freemasonry cannot be limited by gender. In the second half of the 20th century, with the development of the second and third waves of feminism, pressure increased on all spheres of life, including traditionally male clubs and communities. Issues of gender discrimination, equal opportunities, and representation became central to public discourse. And Freemasonry, as an ancient and influential institution, could not stand aside. Women, who had long held leading positions in business, politics, and science, began to ask themselves, why should Freemasonry be an exception? Why were they, like men striving for self-improvement and service to society, denied access to Masonic knowledge and rituals? The arguments of supporters of women's Freemasonry, based on the principles of gender equality and non-discrimination, became increasingly convincing. They argued that Masonic ideals, brotherhood, mutual aid, the pursuit of truth, and moral perfection, are universal and do not have a gender attachment. That denying women participation contradicts the very spirit of Freemasonry, which proclaims that all people are equal before the great architect of the universe. That the exclusion of women impoverishes Freemasonry, depriving it of new perspectives and talents. However, the conservative wing, adhering to traditional views, continued to insist on preserving ancient landmarks. Their counter-arguments were based on historical tradition, on a literal reading of Anderson's constitutions, on symbolism which, in their opinion, was exclusively male. They feared that the inclusion of women would disrupt the internal harmony of the lodges, change the nature of rituals, and undermine the uniqueness of male brotherhood. Some even expressed fears that the appearance of women would lead to the erosion of Masonic values, or to undesirable romantic relationships within the lodges. This struggle for equality was not simple. It took place not only between Masonic jurisdictions, but also within the orders themselves, where some called for reforms and others for the preservation of age-old foundations. Women Masons, in turn, proved in practice that they are capable of being worthy keepers of Masonic traditions, that their participation not only does not destroy Freemasonry, but enriches it. They created their lodges, developed their rituals, actively participated in charitable and educational activities, demonstrating adherence to Masonic ideals. The influence of the feminist movement on Freemasonry is not only a history of schisms and disputes, but also a history of gradual but inevitable transformation. It forced Freemasonry to rethink its principles, its role in the modern world, and, most importantly, its attitude towards women. And although the path to full equality has not yet been traversed, feminism has already left an indelible mark on the Masonic landscape, opening doors to a new reality where a woman can be not only the keeper of the hearth, but also a full-fledged builder of the symbolic temple of humanity. We have seen how the feminist movement challenged age-old traditions, forcing Freemasonry to reconsider its gender barriers. But the world of Freemasonry, like the world in general, is not monolithic. It is divided into hundreds of jurisdictions, each with its own traditions, rules, and, of course, attitudes towards women. And while in France, women's and mixed Freemasonry has long been a reality, in other parts of the world, the situation can be entirely different. Let's embark on a journey across the Masonic map of the world and see how women's Freemasonry is developing in different countries and cultural regions. Let's start with Europe. Here, as we already know, France is the cradle of mixed and women's Freemasonry. The Order of Le Droit Humain, which originated in Paris, spread throughout Europe, establishing lodges in Belgium, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Italy, and other countries. The French Women's Grand Lodge is also actively operating, with branches outside its homeland. In these countries, where liberal Freemasonry has strong positions, women can fully participate in Masonic rituals and hold any office. However, in Great Britain, the birthplace of regular Freemasonry, the situation is drastically different. The United Grand Lodge of England, true to its ancient landmarks, still does not recognize women's Freemasonry. Nevertheless, even here there are women's and mixed lodges, such as the Order of Women Freemasons and the Order of Mixed Freemasonry, which operate independently of male jurisdictions. They follow the same rituals and principles, but do not have official recognition from the UGLE. Let's cross the ocean to North America. In the United States and Canada, regular Freemasonry dominates, strictly adhering to the male principle. However, here paramasonic organizations thrive, such as the Order of the Eastern Star, the Daughters of the Nile, and others, which we have already discussed. These organizations provide women with the opportunity to embrace Masonic values and participate in charitable activities, although they do not provide full Masonic initiation. It is interesting to note that some American Grand Lodges, although they do not recognize women's Freemasonry, allow informal cooperation with paramasonic women's groups in the framework of charitable projects. In South America, the picture is more varied. Here, alongside traditional regular Freemasonry, liberal jurisdictions that are open to women are also actively developing. In Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, there are strong branches of le droit humain, as well as local women's and mixed grand lodges that successfully operate and attract many women. In these countries, cultural and social factors, such as the strong influence of the Catholic Church and traditional patriarchal structures, often create obstacles to the development of women's Freemasonry. However, the growing movement for gender equality and the secularization of society contribute to its spread. In Australia and New Zealand, as in other Commonwealth countries, regular Freemasonry predominates, which does not recognize women's lodges. However, here too, similar to Great Britain, there are independent women's and mixed Masonic orders that operate according to their own statutes. Their members actively participate in public life and charity, proving their commitment to Masonic ideals. Cultural, social, and historical factors play a key role in the spread and recognition of women's Freemasonry. In countries with strong traditions of liberalism and secularism, such as France or some Latin American countries, women's Freemasonry finds more fertile ground. At the same time, in societies where traditional values and patriarchal views remain strong, the development of women's Freemasonry faces greater resistance. Historical ties with the British Empire also have an impact. In countries where Freemasonry was imported from England, the position towards women is generally more conservative. Nevertheless, globalization and informational openness are gradually changing the situation. Women Freemasons from different countries exchange experiences, support each other, and form international networks. This contributes to the gradual recognition of women's Freemasonry, even if it has not yet achieved full equality with men's. The struggle continues, and each country makes its unique contribution to this complex but important history of transformation. We have come a long way, exploring the emergence and development of female Freemasonry, its struggle for recognition on different continents. We have seen how traditions and interpretations of ancient landmarks have changed. But behind all these historical facts, rules, and rituals stand living people. Women who decided to embark on the Masonic path, defying age-old customs. What drives them? What motives lead them to closed lodges, and what do they find within their walls? This is what we will talk about today. Voices from within, testimonies of women Freemasons themselves. These stories, collected from interviews, memoirs, and personal conversations, allow us to truly understand their experience. One of the most common reasons women cite for joining Freemasonry is the search for meaning, the desire for self-improvement. I always felt there had to be some depth, something more than everyday hustle and bustle, says Anna, a member of the mixed lodge Le Droit Humain in France. Freemasonry gave me the tools to find that depth, to work on myself. Many note that Masonic values, brotherhood, mutual aid, the pursuit of truth, ethics, resonate with their own beliefs. I was looking for a community where people strive to become better, where intellect and spiritual development are valued, and not just material wealth, says Maria, a member of the Women's Grand Lodge of Italy. For some women, Freemasonry has become an answer to a deep inner desire to belong to something greater than themselves. It is not just a club of interests, but a path of initiation that promises personal transformation. Quote shares Elena from a Russian mixed lodge. The specifics of women's initiation experience in Freemasonry, of course, differ from men's. If in traditional male lodges, rituals often emphasize the archetype of the warrior, the builder, then in female and mixed lodges, they can be reinterpreted to emphasize other aspects of human existence: intuition, creation, harmony, recalls Sophia, a member of one of the women's lodges in the USA. It was a deep immersion into myself, meeting my fears and hopes. The rituals helped me realize my inner strength, my connection to something ancient and wise. Difficulties of integration, of course, exist. Despite the fact that women actively participate in liberal and mixed lodges, they still face misunderstanding and even condemnation from conservative Masonic circles. When I talk about my involvement in Freemasonry, some male Masons look at me with distrust, admits Laura from Germany. They don't understand how a woman can be a Mason. However, such voices are becoming increasingly rare. Women Freemasons actively prove their worth, holding leading positions in their lodges, participating in international conferences, publishing articles and books. They demonstrate a deep knowledge of Masonic symbolism and rituals, and actively participate in charitable and educational activities. The most important thing I gained in Freemasonry is self-confidence and the ability to think critically, says Alina, a young Mason from Spain. Here I was taught not to take anything on faith, but to seek the truth myself, to ask questions. Freemasonry provides women with unique, transformative opportunities. It is not only a path to self-knowledge and moral growth, but also a platform for developing leadership qualities, the ability to work in a team, speak publicly, and defend one's point of view. In lodges, women find support, understanding, and true sisterhood. I found here not just friends, but like-minded women, says Isabella from a Brazilian lodge. These are women with whom I can talk about any topic, share my thoughts, and be sure that I will be understood and supported. In modern society, where women continue to fight for equality, Freemasonry for many becomes a space where they can realize their potential, feel equal and significant. It is a place where gender stereotypes dissolve in the face of common ideals and the pursuit of light. The voices of these women are not just individual stories. They are testimonies that Freemasonry, with all its ancient traditions, is able to adapt to the challenges of the times, remaining relevant and significant for all who seek truth and strive for perfection, regardless of their gender. We have heard the voices of women who have found their way to the light in Masonic lodges, and we understand that their striving for self-improvement and service knows no gender boundaries. But what next? Can Freemasonry, this ancient and multifaceted institution, fully adapt to the 21st century? Or will centuries-old traditions prove stronger? Today, we will look into the future to explore the prospects of change and the transformation of traditional Freemasonry. What modern trends are shaping the landscape of female Freemasonry now? And how do those very regular Grand Lodges, which have held on to their male roots for so long, react to them? In recent years, we have observed interesting shifts. Although the United Grand Lodge of England and most North American jurisdictions still do not recognize female Freemasonry as regular, their position is gradually softening. Instead of complete ignorance or hostility, we see precedents of cooperation, albeit cautious, between male and female lodges. For example, in some regions, male lodges have begun to allow joint charitable events with female or mixed orders. This does not mean full recognition, but is an important step towards dialogue and mutual understanding. Sometimes this cooperation takes the form of joint lectures or open meetings on non-ritualistic topics, where brothers and sisters can exchange ideas and experiences. Such interactions, although not directly related to ritual work, help break down barriers and foster a more respectful attitude. Another important trend is the change in the internal statutes of some Grand Lodges, which, while remaining male, are beginning to recognize the right of their members to belong to female or mixed Masonic orders as guests or observers. This is not the same as full fraternal recognition, but but it is a departure from the previous strict isolation, where membership in a female lodge could lead to expulsion from a male one. In Europe, especially in countries with strong traditions of liberal Freemasonry, such as France, Belgium, or Spain, cooperation between male and female lodges is much more developed. Here we see examples where male regular lodges, which, although they do not recognize female Freemasonry as such, allow mutual visits to open work, or even joint ceremonies that do not violate their strict rules. This creates a kind of gray area of recognition, where formally there is no full equality, but in fact there is interaction and respect. What scenarios for the evolution of regular Freemasonry regarding female participation can we expect? One possible scenario is the gradual, slow thawing of the ice. Under pressure from public opinion, global trends in gender equality, and internal discussions, more and more Grand Lodges may begin to soften their rules. This may be expressed in the expansion of charitable cooperation, official recognition of female paramasonic organizations, or even a revision of some landmarks concerning gender issues. Another scenario is the creation of two Freemasonries: a male Freemasonry, strictly adhering to traditions, and a female mixed Freemasonry, developing in parallel and having its own international structures of recognition. Perhaps over time, these two streams will be able to find common ground and coexist peacefully without mutual claims to exclusivity. However, there are also factors that may hinder gender integration. This is, first of all, deeply rooted conservatism. For many Masons, preserving traditions is not just a whim, but a matter of identity and fidelity to ideals that have been passed down from generation to generation. Changing the rules, in their opinion, can lead to the loss of Freemasonry's uniqueness. In addition, there is a fear that the inclusion of women may change the nature of rituals and symbolism, which, as we have already said, many perceive as initially male. The question of how to adapt rituals without losing their esoteric meaning remains open and causes heated debate. Finally, there is the factor of fear of the unknown. Freemasonry is a closed society, and any cardinal changes are always perceived with caution. The fear of schisms, loss of members, or external pressure can slow down the integration process. But despite all these obstacles, the movement towards gender integration in Freemasonry seems inevitable. The world is changing, and Freemasonry, to remain relevant and meaningful, must change with it. The question is not whether changes will occur, but how quickly and fully they will occur. And it is the digital age that can become a catalyst for these changes, opening up new opportunities and posing new challenges for female Freemasonry. We have heard the voices of women who have found their way to the light in Masonic lodges, and we understand that their striving for self-improvement and service knows no gender boundaries. But what next? Can Freemasonry, this ancient and multifaceted institution, fully adapt to the 21st century? Or will centuries-old traditions prove stronger? Today, we will look into the future to explore the prospects of change and the transformation of traditional Freemasonry. What modern trends are shaping the landscape of women's Freemasonry now? And how are the very, quote, Grand Lodges, which have clung to their masculine roots for so long, reacting to them? In recent years, we have observed interesting shifts. Although the United Grand Lodge of England and most North American jurisdictions still do not recognize women's Freemasonry as regular, their position is gradually softening. Instead of complete disregard or hostility, we see precedents of cooperation, albeit cautious, between male and female lodges. For example, In some regions, male lodges have begun to allow joint charitable events with female or mixed orders. This does not mean full recognition, but it is an important step towards dialogue and mutual understanding. Sometimes this cooperation takes the form of joint lectures or open meetings on non-ritualistic topics, where brothers and sisters can exchange ideas and experiences. Such interactions, although not directly related to ritual work, help break down barriers and foster a more respectful attitude. Another important trend is the change in the internal statutes of some Grand Lodges, which, while remaining male, are beginning to recognize the right of their members to belong to female or mixed Masonic orders as guests or observers. This is not the same as full fraternal recognition, but it is a departure from the previous strict isolation, where membership in a female lodge could lead to expulsion from a male one. In Europe, especially in countries with strong traditions of liberal Freemasonry, such as France, Belgium, or Spain, cooperation between male and female lodges is much more developed. Here we see examples where regular male lodges, which, although they do not recognize women's Freemasonry as such, allow, quote, to open work or even joint ceremonies that do not violate their strict rules. This creates a kind of, quote, of recognition, where formally there is no full equality, but in fact there is interaction and respect. What scenarios for the evolution of regular Freemasonry regarding female participation can we expect? One possible scenario is a gradual, slow, quote, under pressure from public opinion, global trends in gender equality, and internal discussions, more and more Grand Lodges may begin to soften their rules. This could be expressed in the expansion of charitable cooperation, official recognition of female paramasonic organizations, or even a revision of some landmarks concerning gender issues. Another scenario is the creation of, quote, male Freemasonry, strictly adhering to traditions, and female mixed Freemasonry, developing in parallel and having its own international structures of recognition. Perhaps over time these two will be able to find common ground and coexist peacefully without mutual claims to exclusivity. However, there are also factors that may hinder gender integration. This is, first and foremost, deeply rooted conservatism. For many Masons, preserving traditions is not just a whim, but a matter of identity and fidelity to ideals that have been passed down from generation to generation. Changing the rules, in their opinion, can lead to the loss of Freemasonry's uniqueness. In addition, there is concern that the inclusion of women may change the nature of rituals and symbolism, which, as we have already said, are perceived by many as inherently masculine. The question of how to adapt rituals without losing their esoteric meaning remains open and causes heated debate. Finally, there is the factor of fear of the unknown. Freemasonry is a closed society, and any radical changes are always viewed with caution. The fear of schisms, loss of members, or external pressure can slow down the integration process. But despite all these obstacles, the movement towards gender integration in Freemasonry seems inevitable. The world is changing, and Freemasonry, to remain relevant and significant, must change with it. The question is not whether changes will occur, but how quickly and completely they will occur. And it is the digital age that can become a catalyst for these changes, opening up new opportunities and posing new challenges for women's Freemasonry. We have come a long way, exploring how traditions and symbols shaped Freemasonry, making it a predominantly male space. But the world does not stand still. Global social changes, raging in society, inevitably reach even the most closed institutions. and one of the most powerful currents that changed the face of the 20th and 21st centuries was the feminist movement. Its influence on Freemasonry is a story of struggle, adaptation, and reinterpretation of age-old foundations. Feminism, at its core, has always strived for gender equality, for the recognition of women as full and equal members of society. And this aspiration directly clashed with Masonic tradition, which, as we remember, excluded women from its ranks. In the 19th century, when the first wave of feminism fought for suffrage and access to education, Freemasonry remained an unshakable bastion of male fraternity. Women's suffragists, demanding a place at the table of political decisions, hardly thought about Masonic lodges, but their struggle laid the foundation for future changes. The more women gained positions in public life, the less logical and justified their complete prohibition in organizations proclaiming the principles of freedom and equality seemed. The turning point was the beginning of the 20th century, when feminist ideas began to penetrate into various spheres of life. The creation of the mixed order Le Droit Humain, which we have already discussed, was a direct reflection of these sentiments. Its founders, Maria d'Eresme and Georges Martin, were not just Masons, they were convinced feminists who believed in the possibility of Freemasonry open to all. They argued that the principles of brotherhood and sisterhood are inseparable, and that true Freemasonry cannot be limited by gender. In the second half of the 20th century, with the development of the second and third waves of feminism, pressure increased on all spheres of life, including traditionally male clubs and communities. Issues of gender discrimination, equal opportunities, and representation became central to public discourse. And Freemasonry, as an ancient and influential institution, could not remain aloof. Women, who had long held leading positions in business, politics, and science, began to ask themselves, why should Freemasonry be an exception? Why were they, like men striving for self-improvement and service to society, denied access to Masonic knowledge and rituals? The arguments of supporters of female Freemasonry, based on the principles of gender equality and non-discrimination, became increasingly convincing. They argued that Masonic ideals, brotherhood, mutual aid, the pursuit of truth, and moral improvement are universal and not gender-specific. That denying women participation contradicts the very spirit of Freemasonry, which proclaims that all people are equal before the great architect of the universe. That the exclusion of women impoverishes Freemasonry, depriving it of new perspectives and talents. However, the conservative wing, adhering to traditional views, continued to insist on preserving ancient landmarks. Their counter-arguments were based on historical tradition, on a literal reading of Anderson's constitutions, on symbolism which, in their opinion, was exclusively male. They feared that the inclusion of women would disrupt the internal harmony of the lodges, change the nature of rituals, and undermine the uniqueness of male fraternity. Some even expressed fears that the appearance of women would lead to the erosion of Masonic values or to undesirable romantic relationships within the lodges. This struggle for equality was not simple. It took place not only between Masonic jurisdictions, but also within the orders themselves, where some called for reforms and others for the preservation of age-old traditions. Women Masons, in turn, proved in practice that they are capable of being worthy guardians of Masonic traditions, that their participation not only does not destroy Freemasonry, but enriches it. They created their lodges, developed their rituals, actively participated in charitable and educational activities, demonstrating their commitment to Masonic ideals. The influence of the feminist movement on Freemasonry is not only a history of schisms and disputes, but also a history of gradual but inevitable transformation. It forced Freemasonry to rethink its principles. its role in the modern world, and, most importantly, its attitude towards women. And although the path to full equality has not yet been traversed, feminism has already left an indelible mark on the Masonic landscape, opening doors to a new reality where a woman can be not only the keeper of the hearth, but also a full-fledged builder of the symbolic temple of humanity. To understand why Masonic lodges remained an exclusively male domain for centuries, we must journey to the heart of pressing the 18th century, to the year 1723. It was then that one of the foundational documents of modern Freemasonry, the famous Anderson's Constitutions, was published. This text, which became a cornerstone for all subsequent regular Masonic jurisdictions, not only enshrined the rules and principles of the Brotherhood, but also effectively closed the doors of the lodges to women. But why? What was so special about that time that dictated such strict gender restrictions? The 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, was a time of great intellectual and social change. However, despite progressive ideas about reason and freedom, society remained deeply patriarchal. The man was the head of the family, a public figure, the primary bearer of knowledge and power. The woman was assigned the role of keeper of the hearth, mother, and wife. Her participation in public life, science, or politics was considered unacceptable and even dangerous. This view permeated all strata of society, and Freemasonry, being a product of its time, could not remain aloof. Early speculative Freemasonry, which was just forming on the basis of stonemasons' guilds, adopted their strictly male character. Masons, builders of cathedrals and castles, were exclusively men. Their craft required physical endurance, constant travel, and often risky working conditions. Women simply did not have access to these professions. And when operative Freemasonry, that is, the craft of stonemasons, transformed into speculative, that is, a brotherhood of philosophers and thinkers, many of these rules and traditions were inherited, including the exclusion of women. Anderson's Constitutions, developed by James Anderson and Jean-Théophile Desaguliers, were intended to unify the rules and rituals of various lodges, creating a single structure. The section on candidate qualifications clearly stated that only men, free, mature, and of good reputation, could be admitted to the Brotherhood. No exceptions. This was not a malicious act against women, but rather a reflection of the generally accepted norms and ideas of the time. In the public consciousness, a woman simply did not fit the image of a, quote, capable of performing, quote. Thus, the early restrictions enshrined in Anderson's Constitutions were not accidental. They were a direct consequence of the socio-historical conditions of the 18th century, where patriarchal tradition dominated all spheres of life. These provisions shaped the subsequent perception of women in the context of Masonic lodges, laying the foundation for a centuries-old prohibition and determining the trajectory of Freemasonry's development as an exclusively male community. And this, as you understand, is just the beginning of a long journey. But even the strictest prohibitions could not completely stop those who yearned for knowledge and strived for the light of truth. In a world where Masonic lodges were a stronghold of male brotherhood, there were women whose courage and determination allowed them to lift the veil of secrecy. These pioneers, who broke unwritten and written rules, became harbingers of coming changes, showing that the pursuit of Masonic ideals knows no gender boundaries. One of the most famous figures, whose story has become legendary, is Elizabeth Aldworth. This Irish aristocrat, born at the end of the 17th century, accidentally witnessed a Masonic ritual. According to one version, while still very young, she hid in a room adjacent to the lodge and overheard all the secret rites. According to another, more dramatic version, she was discovered during the initiation, and the brothers faced a difficult choice: either kill the uninvited guest or initiate her into Masonic secrets. The latter was chosen. Thus, in the early 18th century, Elizabeth Aldworth became the first known female Mason to receive the degrees of Entered Apprentice, Fellowcraft, and Master. Her story, though shrouded in myths, vividly demonstrates the precedent of female participation in a male brotherhood, albeit a forced one. Centuries later, in the heart of France, another woman challenged traditions. This refers to the Countess de Richelieu, niece of the famous cardinal. In the mid-18th century, at the height of the Enlightenment, she, according to contemporaries, actively participated in Masonic meetings. How was this possible? Perhaps her high social status and influence allowed her to bypass strict rules. Or, more likely, she participated in so-called Masonic adoptive lodges, which, although connected to male Freemasonry, had their own rituals and were intended for women. These lodges, though not recognized by regular Freemasonry, were the first step towards the creation of female Masonic structures. Or take, for example, Charlotte von Geldern, Countess de Warigny, who at the end of the 18th century was admitted to the Phoenix Lodge in Germany. Her case also shows that, despite official prohibitions, some lodges made exceptions, dictated either by personal connections or special circumstances. These women did not just penetrate the veil of secrecy, they became living proof that Masonic ideals of universal brotherhood and equality can also be applied to the female sex, even if official documents stated otherwise. These isolated, sometimes legendary cases were not just curious anecdotes from the history of Freemasonry. They became important precedents that, like drops, wore away the stone of age-old prohibitions. Each such story, passed down by word of mouth, strengthened the idea that women could be worthy members of the brotherhood, that their intellect and desire for self-improvement were not alien to Masonic principles. These brave pioneers, although they did not lead to an immediate change in rules, sowed the seeds of doubt in the immutability of male dominance, paving the way for a future struggle for equality and the emergence of full-fledged female and mixed Freemasonry. Their stories are not just chapters in the book of Freemasonry, they are chapters in the history of humanity's quest for freedom and equality. Isolated cases of women penetrating male lodges were mere sparks. But at the very end of the 19th century, a true fire erupted in France, forever changing the landscape of Freemasonry. This was the birth of the co-Masonic order Le Droit Humain, or human rights, a revolutionary movement that proclaimed the equality of men and women in the Masonic Brotherhood. And behind this breakthrough stood two remarkable personalities, Maria Deresme and Georges Martin. Maria Deresme, a charismatic and convinced feminist, was one of the first women in France to earn a bachelor's degree. She actively fought for women's rights, for their access to education and political life. In 1882, she was initiated into the Masonic Lodge, Free Thinkers, in the city of Pec. This was an unprecedented event that caused a storm of indignation in traditional Masonic circles. Her initiation was annulled, and the lodge that took such a step was excluded from its obedience. But Maria did not give up. She was supported by Georges Martin, a senator, a member of the Grand Orient de France, and a staunch supporter of women's equality. Together, they came to realize that true Freemasonry should be open to all, regardless of gender. In 1893, in Paris, Deresme and Martin founded the first co-Masonic lodge, which later transformed into the international co-Masonic order Le Droit Humain. Its principles were simple and profound. Absolute equality of men and women, joint work on self-improvement, and service to humanity. Le droit humain rejected all forms of discrimination, whether based on gender, race, nationality, or creed. This was a true manifesto of freedom and equality in a world where most Masonic organizations still clung to outdated patriarchal dogmas. The order quickly gained popularity. Co-Masonic lodges of Le Droit Humain began to spread across Europe like wildfire. In the early 20th century, they appeared in England, Belgium, Switzerland, Holland, and then beyond the European continent. This new form of Freemasonry offered women not just passive participation, but full involvement in rituals, the study of symbolism, and work on self-improvement. They could hold any position in the lodge, be masters and leaders. The influence of Le Droit Humain on the global Masonic movement was enormous. It became living proof that Freemasonry can be universal, that its principles of brotherhood and sisterhood can unite people beyond gender boundaries. This order not only opened doors for women, but also forced many traditional lodges to rethink their positions, even if not immediately. Of course, the path of Le Droit Humain was not easy. The order faced fierce resistance from conservative Masonic jurisdictions that refused to recognize its legitimacy. It was accused of violating ancient landmarks and undermining Masonic tradition. However, despite all obstacles, Le Droit Humain continued to grow and develop, becoming a symbol of progress and the struggle for equality in the Masonic world. This was not just the creation of a new organization. It was the proclamation of a new era in the history of Freemasonry, an era where women could stand equally with men at the altar and work on the great task of building the temple of humanity. Although Le Droit Humain paved the way, its emergence was merely the first step in a multifaceted movement for women's equality in Freemasonry. The 19th and 20th centuries witnessed the flourishing of a wide variety of women's and paramasonic organizations, each seeking its own path to light. These structures, sometimes closely connected to male Freemasonry, sometimes entirely autonomous, strived to embody Masonic ideals in a context acceptable to women. One of the most well-known and influential paramasonic organizations open to women was the Order of the Eastern Star. Founded in the United States of America in 1855 by Robert Morris, it is not Freemasonry in the strict sense of the word, but is closely associated with it. Members of the order can only be Master Masons and their close female relatives, wives, daughters, sisters, mothers, widows. Its rituals, though inspired by Masonic symbolism, have their unique structure and focus on biblical female characters such as Ada, Ruth, Esther, Martha, and Electa, each embodying a specific virtue. The Order of the Eastern Star quickly spread throughout the world, becoming the largest women's paramasonic organization with millions of members. It provides women with the opportunity to engage in charitable activities, develop leadership skills, and feel part of a large fraternity, albeit without fully sharing traditional Masonic rituals and degrees. This is a vivid example of how women's organizations created parallel structures to realize their aspirations for self-improvement and service. Another interesting example is the Daughters of the Nile, also a paramasonic organization founded in 1893 in the United States of America. It is an auxiliary body for the Shriners, another paramasonic group closely associated with Freemasonry. Members of the Daughters of the Nile can only be wives, widows, mothers, sisters, and daughters of Shriners. Their rituals are inspired by Egyptian symbolism and culture, and their primary goal is charity, especially supporting Shriner children's hospitals. These organizations, though not independent Masonic lodges, play an important role in providing women with the opportunity to partake in Masonic values and traditions, albeit through auxiliary structures. But there were also those who sought full and independent women's Freemasonry. A striking example is the Women's Grand Lodge of France, founded in 1945 based on already existing women's lodges. This organization is entirely autonomous from male Freemasonry and professes the principles of regular Freemasonry, but adapted for women. The Women's Grand Lodge of France has its own rituals, its own degrees, and its own grand lodges, completely independent of male ones. It is one of the most influential women's Masonic orders in the world, recognized by many liberal Masonic jurisdictions. Its existence proves that women are capable not only of participating in Masonic rituals, but also of fully managing Masonic structures, while preserving the authenticity of the tradition. These women's and paramasonic organizations, each in their own way, were able to embody genuine Masonic traditions, adapting them to women's experience and needs. They proved that the aspiration for light, for self-improvement, and for serving humanity has no gender prejudices. However, their place in the Masonic landscape remains a subject of heated debate. Regular Freemasonry, adhering to Anderson's constitutions, still does not recognize these organizations, considering them irregular or paramasonic. But this does not detract from their significance. They became a powerful voice for women in the Masonic world, paving the way for a more inclusive and egalitarian future. We have seen women make their way into Freemasonry by creating new orders and organizations. But how did the Big Brother react to this? How did traditional, or as it is also called, regular Freemasonry, view these bold steps? This question is one of the most acute and controversial in the history of Freemasonry, because to understand its essence, we need to delve into the concepts of regularity, recognition, and jurisdiction. Imagine Freemastronomy as a huge old tree with many branches. Each branch is a separate grand lodge or order operating in a specific territory, and these branches can be either regular or irregular. What does regularity mean? In the Masonic world, it is not just a word, it is the foundation of legitimacy. Regularity is determined by strict adherence to the ancient landmarks, the fundamental principles of Freemasonry. Among them are faith in the great architect of the universe, the obligatory presence of the volume of sacred law on the altar, and of course, the very point that only free men of mature age can work in lodges. It is this point that became a stumbling block for female and mixed-gender Freemasonry. Recognition is an act by one regular Grand Lodge that agrees to consider another Grand Lodge or order legitimate and regular. If one branch recognizes another, they can exchange visits, conduct joint work, and consider each other part of a single Masonic world. If there is no recognition, then the lodges do not interact, and their members cannot attend each other's meetings. Jurisdiction refers to the territory in which a given Grand Lodge has the exclusive right to Masonic activity. For example, in England, there is one large regular jurisdiction, and in the United States, there is one for each state. Now that we have clarified the terms, let's see how these principles were applied to female Freemasonry. The position of the largest Masonic jurisdictions, such as the United Grand Lodge of England, or UGLE, and the United Grand Lodges of Germany, has always been unequivocal. They believe that Freemasonry is inherently a male fraternity, and the participation of women in lodges does not comply with the ancient landmarks. For them, it is not a matter of discrimination, but a matter of preserving tradition. They do not dispute the right of women to create their own organizations, but refuse to recognize them as Masonic in the traditional sense. Yugal, considered the mother of all regular Masonic lodges in the world, clearly states that the only form of Freemasonry it recognizes is Freemasonry for men. This means that for it, female and mixed-gender lodges are not regular and therefore are not recognized. Most American Grand Lodges, united in the Conference of Grand Masters of North America, take the same position. They maintain strict gender segregation, explaining it by the immutability of ancient statutes and rituals, which, in their opinion, were originally created for men and cannot be changed. The reasons for such a strict position are deeply rooted in history. As we have already said, Anderson's constitutions, adopted in 1723, clearly stipulated that only men could be members of the fraternity. And for traditional Masons, this is not just a rule. It is part of their historical heritage, the foundation upon which the entire structure rests. Changing this rule, in their opinion, would mean undermining the very essence of Freemasonry. In addition, there is the argument of symbolism. Some traditional Masons believe that Masonic rituals and symbols have masculine energy and cannot be applied to women without losing their esoteric meaning. They see Freemasonry as a path to self-improvement that is unique to the male experience. However, despite this strict position, it should be noted that regular Freemasonry does not forbid its members from being courteous and respectful towards women who are members of female or mixed-gender orders. They simply do not view them as Masons in the same sense that they view each other. This creates a complex situation where different Masonic worlds coexist, but rarely intersect. Thus, the position of regular Freemasonry toward female and mixed-gender Freemasonry is one of preserving tradition and loyalty to ancient landmarks. This is not always easy to understand in the modern world, where gender equality has become the norm. But for traditional Masons, it is a matter of the identity and authenticity of their fraternity. And as long as this position remains unchanged, the path to full recognition of female Freemasonry remains long and arduous. Now that we understand why traditional Freemasonry so stubbornly adheres to its male roots, let's delve deeper into the Brotherhood's most intimate world, its rituals and symbolism. For it is here, in the intertwining of ancient signs and ceremonies, that the key to understanding the gender aspect of Freemasonry lies. Masonic symbolism, like the tradition itself, is permeated with duality. We see the sun and the moon, day and night, light and darkness, spirit and matter. All of this is a reflection of the great principle of balance, upon which, according to Masons, the universe is founded. But how do the masculine and feminine principles fit into this universal duality? Traditionally, Masonic symbols have been interpreted from a male perspective. The compass and square, the hammer and chisel, stonemasons' tools symbolizing reason, will, and the labor of self-improvement. These symbols undoubtedly have universal significance, but their initially male nature within the context of the Brotherhood is undeniable. The feminine principle, however, seemed to be absent from this male symbolic system. Yet, this is only at first glance. If one looks more closely, it is possible to discover that many Masonic symbols carry an esoteric meaning that can be interpreted as a manifestation of both masculine and feminine archetypes. For example, the temple, which Masons symbolically build, can be perceived not only as an abode of wisdom, but also as a womb containing the mysteries of being, which refers us to the feminine generative principle. The earth, as a symbol of fertility and the material world, is also associated with femininity. As for the rituals, they were undoubtedly developed by men and for men. Initiation, the progression through degrees. All this reflects the male path to knowledge and development. And it is here that one of the main questions arises: how to adapt these rituals for women's lodges? When the first women's and mixed Masonic orders appeared, they had to face this dilemma. Can one simply replace male pronouns with female ones and consider the ritual adapted? Or is a deeper transformation necessary for the rituals to reflect the female experience of initiation and development? Some women's lodges opted for minimal changes, preserving the basic structure and symbolism, but adapting the language. Others, such as some branches of le droit humain, sought to reevaluate the rituals, introducing elements more consonant with female psychology and spiritual path. This could manifest in an emphasis on intuition, emotional depth, or in the use of symbols traditionally associated with the feminine principle, such as the moon, water, or images of goddesses. The challenge of preserving the authenticity of tradition while including women is a delicate balance. On the one hand, the desire to preserve ancient landmarks and rituals in their pristine form. On the other, the need to make Freemasonry relevant and meaningful to all who seek light. And here, the esoteric meaning of duality in Masonic teaching comes to the fore. For Freemasonry teaches us to see unity in diversity, harmony in opposites. And if we speak of the great architect of the universe, it is not merely a male figure, but a universal principle of creation that includes both masculine and feminine principles. In this sense, duality, or binary, is not merely separation, but complementarity. The masculine and feminine principles are two sides of the same coin, necessary for full development and Hawaii. True Freemasonry, perhaps, seeks not the exclusion of one in favor of the other, but their synthesis, their unification in a single striving for perfection. And then, symbolism, which at first glance seems exclusively male, can be reinterpreted through the prism of this universal unity, opening new facets of meaning for all who embark on the Masonic path, regardless of gender. We have seen how traditions and symbols have shaped Freemasonry for millennia, making it an exclusively male space. But the world is changing, and ancient institutions are transforming with it. This is where liberal or adogmatic Freemasonry enters the scene, a phenomenon that has become a true bridge between strict tradition and the challenges of modern reality, opening its doors to women. What exactly is this liberal Freemasonry, and how does it differ from regular Freemasonry? The main difference lies in its approach to the principle of freedom of conscience. While traditional Freemasonry requires its members to believe in the great architect of the universe as a personified god, liberal jurisdictions, such as the Grand Orient of France, proclaim absolute freedom of thought and conscience. This means that for them, what a person believes in is not as important as their striving for moral improvement and service to humanity. This principle became the starting point for the inclusion of women. The Grand Orient of France, the oldest and largest liberal Masonic jurisdiction, began to reevaluate its positions as early as the 19th century. As we recall, in 1893, it faced the precedent of Maria de Reims' initiation, which led to the creation of le droit humain. But the Grand Orient itself, though not immediately, gradually moved towards gender integration. In 2010, the Grand Orient of France officially allowed women to be initiated into its lodges, and also to accept already initiated women from other liberal jurisdictions into its ranks. This was a truly revolutionary decision, undermining centuries-old foundations. They argued that brotherhood and equality cannot be limited by gender, and that Masonic landmarks that prohibit women from joining lodges are not immutable, but can be interpreted in accordance with modern values. In addition to the Grand Orient of France, there are other influential liberal jurisdictions that actively open their doors to women. For example, the Grand Symbolic Lodge of Spain. This jurisdiction, formed in 1979 after the fall of the Franco regime, is a prime example of modern liberal Freemasonry. From its inception, it proclaimed gender equality and actively works to attract women to its ranks. Spanish liberal Masons believe that the principles of liberty, electricity, and fraternity should extend to all people, regardless of their gender, race, or creed. Their approach to Masonic landmarks is more flexible. They do not deny their historical significance, but believe that the interpretation of these principles should correspond to the spirit of the times and universal human values. For them, the transformation of Masonic landmarks is not a retreat from tradition, but its development and adaptation to a changing world. Liberal Freemasonry has become a haven for those who seek Masonic light, but do not find it within the strict confines of traditional lodges. It offers women full participation in rituals, the opportunity to hold any office in the lodge, and active involvement in intellectual and charitable activities. This is not simply women's Freemasonry. It is Freemasonry that strives for inclusivity and universality, where gender is not a barrier to spiritual and moral growth. Of course, this path is not without its difficulties. Liberal Freemasonry is often not recognized by regular jurisdictions, which creates certain limitations. Nevertheless, it continues to develop, attracting more and more adherents and proving that Freemasonry can be a dynamic and adaptable institution. It demonstrates that ancient principles of brotherhood and improvement can be universal, encompassing both men and women in their common quest for light and truth. This phenomenon of liberal Freemasonry is not just a statistical fact, but a powerful indicator of how deeply perceptions of equality and inclusivity are changing, even in the most conservative communities. We have come a long way exploring Masonic landmarks, precedents, and revolutionary changes. But to truly understand the origins of gender segregation in Freemasonry, we need to look even deeper into the cultural and religious layers that have shaped human consciousness for millennia. After all, Freemasonry, for all its uniqueness, does not exist in a vacuum. It is a product of its time and society, reflecting its values and prejudices. And if we want to understand why women were denied access to sacred spaces, we need to draw parallels with other esoteric and religious traditions. Let us recall ancient cults, where access to sacred rites and secret knowledge was often strictly divided by gender. In the Eleusinian mysteries, for example, women played an important role, but their functions differed from those of men. In some pagan cults, only women could be priestesses. In others, only men. This was not a universal rule, but the tendency towards gender segregation in sacred spaces can be traced in many cultures. The influence of Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam on the formation of Masonic attitudes towards women can hardly be overestimated. All three religions, albeit in different ways, set certain boundaries for the role of women in spiritual and public life. In Judaism, women are traditionally exempt from certain religious duties, such as regular synagogue attendance or studying the Torah to the same extent as men. Their role is focused on the family and the home, which, of course, has sacred significance, but separates them from public religious service. In Christianity, especially in its conservative currents, the role of women in the church hierarchy is also limited. Women cannot be priests or bishops in most traditional churches. Apostle Paul, in his epistles, urged women to keep silent in churches and not to teach men, which for centuries served as a basis for excluding women from active participation in religious life. In Islam, women also have their separate places for prayer in mosques, and have certain restrictions in performing religious duties. These traditions, formed over millennia, created a powerful cultural narrative in which the sacred space was often associated with the masculine principle, and women were seen as guardians of the home, but not as active participants in public spiritual practices. Freemasonry, which emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, was a product of European culture, deeply imbued with Christian and therefore Abrahamic values. And although Freemasonry is not a religion in the strict sense of the word, it uses religious symbolism and ethics. Therefore, it is not surprising that many of these cultural and religious prejudices were incorporated into early Freemasonry. The exclusion of women from lodges was not a malicious act, but rather a reflection of generally accepted ideas about the place of women in society and their role in sacred space. Women were perceived as more emotional, less rational, and therefore less suitable for the strict intellectual and spiritual practices required of a Mason. However, in modern society, these views are undergoing significant evolution. Feminist movements, the struggle for gender equality, the rethinking of the role of women in the family and society, all this could not but affect Freemasonry. Today, many religious denominations are reviewing their positions on women's ordination and the participation of women in spiritual life. This global shift in the perception of gender also challenges Freemasonry, forcing it to adapt to a new reality. The question of whether a woman can be a full participant in sacred space now stands not only before religious organizations, but also before Masonic lodges. And the answer to this question is no longer as clear-cut as it was a few centuries ago. Perhaps it is in this rethinking that the path to a new, more inclusive Freemasonry lies, one that can unite all who strive for light, regardless of gender.